Okay, so having finished reading the book of Joshua, the beginning of Judges, I think, should come as something of a little bit of a surprise. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, which of us shall be the first to go up against the Canaanites and attack them? Be like, I'm sorry, what did we just spend an entire book doing? Remember, we had a whole thing where the land was at rest from war, and everything was fulfilled, and what is this go up stuff? I thought we'd been there already. The Judites attacked Jerusalem. That's weird because back in Joshua 10, we had definitely gotten rid of all the kings of Jerusalem and put them on stakes, as one does. And in fact, already apportioned it to the Benjaminites. Like, what are we doing here? So what's up with Jerusalem? What's up with the city of Hebron? Right, we have the Judites who are marching against the Canaanites in Hebron. Also, which is weird because in Joshua 10, they captured it and they put it to the sword and prescribed it, right, Cherem. In Joshua 11, we are told that Joshua went and wiped out all the Anakites from the hill country of Judah, from Hebron, even though here, an entire book later, they seem to be doing it again. In Joshua 15, we had Joshua giving Caleb his portion of Hebron and dislodging from there Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai, which is weird because here we are again a book later, and those same three dudes happen to still somehow be around. Then we come to, again, I'm just reading in Judges 1, right? This is just the first chapter. We have Caleb saying, I'll give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiryat Sefer, and his younger kinsman Othniel the Kenizzite captured it, and Caleb gave him his daughter Achsah in marriage. And if you if you blink for a second here, you're going to miss what I'm about to do. But here's Joshua 15. Wait, one more time, just in case you missed it. Judges 1, Joshua 15, Judges 1, Joshua. All this, it's evidently the only difference is a little bit of like kerning down in here in the fourth line from the bottom. Oh no, it's it's the quotation marks have gone the wrong way. Boop, 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 boop. And this is the kind of thing that happens in the Bible, and we say text critical. Anyway, that's fine. So anyway, as you can see, we find ourselves, so it continues on through the end of Judges 1. Cities now said to be conquered in Judges 1 were already conquered by Joshua. Cities said not to have been conquered according to Judges 1 were also already conquered by Joshua back in Joshua. So after the complete conquest that is presented to us in the book of Joshua, it's confusing that the Israelites are said not to have dispossessed various people groups among the Canaanites. And it's clear that what's intended here is not that, that's in Joshua they tried but failed, and that's why we find ourselves in the situation in Judges. No. It's very clear that they didn't even try, right? I have brought you up, and I said, I'll never break my covenant with you, and you make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land, but you haven't obeyed me, right? You haven't obeyed me. Look what you've done, right? You are clearly not trying to dispossess them. You are engaging with them, intermarrying with them, and therefore I have resolved to drive them out, not to drive them out before you, right? So something quite different. This is in turn followed by a passage that, again, seems to know nothing about this that was just said. When Joshua dismissed the people, this is in the book of Judges now, the Israelites went to their allotted territories and took possession of the land, and they served the Lord during the lifetime of Joshua and the lifetime of the older people who lived on after Joshua. That's very happy, and not at all what I just read a few verses ago that was like, you didn't even try, right? In other words, what we have is fairly significant contradictions here in the biblical text. And again, I'm not going to talk about what that means for the existence of sources. Instead, I'm going to ask, what was the historian who put these sources together, these contradictory sources together? What was that historian thinking? Right? So we need to remember that the Deuteronomistic historian was not interested in creating a perfectly smooth history, seems to have been perfectly happy with contradictory stories, as long as those stories could be woven into and worked into the larger sort of history and ideology that he's trying to put across. Right? So anything that could be fit into this larger conceptual framework was basically acceptable to the historian. And both the story of Joshua and the contradictory stories at the beginning of Judges work for the historian. In fact, the account in Judges is almost necessary for the historian, right? The historian needs there to be other nations around. Right? A complete conquest like we have in Joshua doesn't really do the historian much good. He needs there to be other nations because he needs Israel to disobey. Right? If it's just Israel there by itself, there's no temptation of other gods to worship. Right? There'd be no sin to be punished. And the whole historical concept would kind of be moot. So, with that in mind, we might note the way the historian generally introduces the period of the Judges. Right? The Israelites did what was offensive to the Lord. Right? So they disobeyed. They followed the gods of their neighbors. And they were punished. Right? The Lord was incensed and handed them over to foes and surrendered them to their enemies. And the hand of the Lord was against them, as the Lord had declared and the Lord had sworn. Right? They were punished just as Deuteronomy said that they would be. And even when they were rescued, God raised up chieftains. Right? Even when they were rescued, they couldn't follow the laws. Right? They didn't heed their chieftains either. They went astray after other gods and bowed down to them and were quick to turn aside. But as with Joshua and Moses, when there is a leader present, right? When the Lord raised up chieftains for them, when there's a leader present, they're pretty good. Right? They're a relatively obedient people when they've got someone in charge. Right? The chieftain would save them, but when the chieftain dies, they fall back into their old practices. So the existence of indigenous Canaanite populations among the Israelites is actually an absolute necessity for the Deuteronomistic historian. As it says, it was in order to test Israel by them, to see whether Israel would faithfully walk in the ways of the Lord, as their fathers had done, that the Lord had left those nations. Right? We have an ideological, theological explanation. Those nations were left as a means of testing Israel to learn whether they would obey the commandments which the Lord had enjoined upon them. And that's the basic introduction to the entirety of Judges, and everything else is just the working out of this in detail. But it's fun detail. Right? Is the nice thing about the book of Judges. The first thing that happens, as expected, is Israelite apostasy. Right? The Israelites settled among these very nations that we were told in Deuteronomy they are absolutely not supposed to have anything to do with. And they took their daughters to wife and gave their daughters to their own daughters to their sons. Right? That's all exactly what Deuteronomy said absolutely don't do. And the Israelites thereby did what was offensive, and they worshipped foreign gods. And of course, the very next thing is, okay, so God gets angry and surrenders them to, as we all know, King Cushan Rishatayim of Aram Naharaim. And the Israelites were subject to Cushan Rishatayim for 8 years. That's just fun to say. It's not going to be on the exam or anything, don't worry about it. Well, a thing to note as we see from just this first example, the people who oppress the Israelites are, with one notable exception, always foreigners. Like they're always like people from outside of the Canaanite sphere. Right? They're not the peoples that Israel is supposed to be conquering and dispossessing. They're outsiders, foreigners. So here, for instance, it's the Arameans. Right? In other instances, it's the Moabites and the Midianites and the Philistines and the Ammonites. Right? Very rarely is it actually the Canaanites or any of these indigenous people that are supposed to be wiped out. As expected, after there enough of this punishment, Israelites figure it out and they repent. And God gives them a champion, a deliverer, who takes up the role of judge, and that's Othniel from Hebron. And Othniel defeats the foreign conquerors, and the land has peace for 40 years, which is probably, let's say certainly, not a real number, right? In the same way that 400 years isn't a real number. Just assume that no numbers are real numbers in the Bible. They knew how to count. They just did it in inventive ways. So 40 is here, as so often the case, 40 days and 40 nights, right? 40 days of the flood. It just means a long time. And, we shouldn't ask questions like, is 40 years really how long Othniel was judge? I don't know. Like, was Othniel really judge? We're not yet into the realm of asking questions like, is that the real length of time for that story I just read in the Bible? We're not there yet. We'll get there. Even this semester, maybe. After Othniel, the people screw up again and are punished again, and so we get Ehud. And in terms of narrative art, the story of Ehud, which is not super long, ranks to my mind among the great biblical stories. Just the detail of the stories, like the little elements that make the story of Ehud work. It's just like it's a terrific little bit. Ehud, we are told, is left-handed, which is like a passing the all the lefties. Okay, two of the lefties in the back of the room were like, yeah. Ehud is left-handed, which makes him sort of a surprise attacker, as it will, right? Like people don't expect the attack to come from that side. He has a double-edged dagger, we're told, which will make his strike more effective, which he hides on the right side under his cloak, which again makes sense. He's a lefty, right? So he hides it over here. But again, when in a right-handed world, no one expects the left-handed attacker, I guess. We're told that Eglon is very stout. He's a fat man, which creates this more precise mental image and might remind us just how infrequently we get anything resembling physical description of any characters anywhere in the Bible. Occasionally we're told that someone's good-looking. Joseph's good-looking. Absalom is good-looking, as we'll find out. Moses, I know nothing, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, nothing, right? We just don't know what any people looked like. We don't even have even the minor physical description like this, right? So this becomes, again, we're getting a picture painted for us in this story. Eglon receives Ehud while the cool upper chamber is a euphemism for the place where, to use another euphemism, Eglon is taking care of his business. And that is precisely what allows Ehud to eventually escape, because Eglon's, his servants are like, I'm not going to go in there. He's taking care of his business in the cool upper chamber. And then so Ehud can escape. And some people have suggested that Ehud escapes by going out through what we would now call the pipes, which is gross. But again, what a story. And then Ehud relocks, I guess it's not the case, because he relocks the door on his way out, giving him time to get away. Wait, you may gloss over and just let your eyes go over this story, but this is a story that has narrative detail of a sort that we have basically not seen to this point, right? This kind of, you can really picture what's happening in this story as opposed to having to invent. It's just a reminder that the biblical authors and storytellers did have the capacity to write and narrate in this really more modernist, I guess, sort of compelling way, with the close narrative detail. And maybe choose not to at other times, but they're really good authors. Okay, moving along from that. The story and the song in Judges 4 through 5 is unique in a number of ways. Most obviously, it's about two women with male figures playing supporting roles. But most obviously, not most obviously, but it's also a story in which the opponent is not foreign, but Canaanite, right? This is the one story of this kind. So it's King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. Deborah is first and foremost a prophetess, not a judge, though she does play the role of judge as well. But it's interesting that she's introduced as being a prophet. It's also interesting in a less good way that she's introduced as being someone's wife before we're told what her actual job is. There's another nod to the patriarchal society from which this text emerged and the patriarchal nature of the text itself. Here in this story, the judge at hand, that is Deborah, doesn't actually do any of the fighting. Right? She is more of an inspirational leader. She's more Moses than Joshua, as it were. And just while we're here, to draw our attention briefly to another issue, here in Judges, God has turned them over to King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor, which back in Joshua 11 had already been conquered along with its king. So, in any case, back to our story. Deborah, the Ephraimite prophetess, calls Barak to war, Barak, the Israelite general, and basically because he's not man enough to go himself, it won't be a man who kills Sisera, the Canaanite general. So says the Bible. So says Deborah. Sure enough, according to the story, Barak defeats Sisera's army, but Sisera himself runs away. This is not a story about great male bravery, which is another reason why it is, in fact, relatively unusual. Not that there aren't plenty of stories about not male bravery in the text, but there are not very many in which women are presented as so clearly outdoing men in the very thing that is like the male work, as it were. Sisera comes to Yael's tent, and she kills him in this particularly brutal manner. When I was growing up in my synagogue, there was a painting on the wall of the synagogue of a woman holding a hammer like this. It was a painting, it was a statue or something, and it was Yael, and I had no idea what it was referring to, none at all. But I thought it was. There was like Moses holding up the law and Yael holding up a hammer, and those were like the two pieces of art that I had in front of me. And I had no idea what she was about to hammer into what. So that's the story, the Deborah story, the narrative and the poem that follows directly after, which is the sort of poetic version of the prose, or you could think of the prose as a prosodic version of the poem. But there are some interesting aspects of the poem in Judges 5 that aren't present in the narrative of Judges 4. In the poem, we get praise for the tribes that participated in the battle, Ephraim and Naphtali and Zebulun and Issachar, even though Issachar, it turns out, doesn't show up actually in the prose account in Judges 4. And in the poem, the tribes that didn't participate in this war against the Canaanite king are castigated for it. Reuben, what are you, like you were sitting on your butt, man? Among the clans of Reuben were great searchings of heart. It's like a great way of saying, like, you couldn't make up your mind to do this. Gilead tarried. Dan lingered. Asher remained. And Meroz didn't come to the aid of the Lord. A few items are particularly interesting here. There are tribes here there are tribes that are not mentioned at all anywhere in the poem. Judah and Simeon and Benjamin, which you may in your mind recognize as southern tribes, are not mentioned at all as participating here. There are tribes in this poem that we have never heard of. Machir and Gilead and Meroz. I mean, we might have heard of them as places, but not as tribes, right, that are talked about on the same level as Reuben and Dan in this case. And in the narrative, the tribes that fight are those who are explicitly called, right? They're summoned to battle. Other tribes seem simply not to have been invited to this particular war. So, we can ask all kinds of questions about the difference between the story and the poem, the narrative and the poetry. We can ask questions about how poetically narratives can become expressed. There's something about this poem that seems like a really interesting historical record, in large part because of the way that it treats these tribes. It seems to be quite old, again, given the fact that some tribes aren't listed among its tribal groupings, and some tribes we've never heard of are. Right? It's possible that this poem comes from a time before the 12-tribe system we know and love was actually established. I should say the language of the poem is also quite discernibly old. Right? You all presumably recognize that Hebrew, like every language, has changed over time, and older Hebrew looks older, and more recent Hebrew looks newer. Boy, was that useful. It's the difference between reading Chaucer and Shakespeare and contemporary English, right? You know it's all English, right? But you also know when you're reading Shakespeare that that's older English than the English you're used to. Same thing with the biblical text. There is Hebrew that is clearly older, and clearly this Hebrew that's clearly younger. So the Hebrew here is clearly very old. In other words, it seems like the poem about Deborah is much older than the narrative, and probably it's in the case that the poem provided the basis for the narrative. The poem, by the way, in Judges 5 also introduces yet another female character, Sisera's mother, which is, in sort of like a funny, a denouement sort of moment, right? Sisera has died, and we sort of get this poignant, what seems to be a poignant view of Sisera's mother waiting for her son to return, imagining he must be delayed by victory, whereas we who have read the poem to this point know the truth. He's not delayed by victory at all. He's lying dead in Yael's tent. And it has a very poignant feeling to it, which I think is probably part of our modern emotional response to such a thing, because the poem itself ends, "So may all your enemies perish," which doesn't feel very sympathetic to Sisera or his mother. There's so much more to be said about Deborah, but again, I got an entire book to rush through, and I've only gotten through chapter 5. After Deborah, the Israelites disobey again, of course, and the historian takes a moment and recontextualizes us, right? Lets us know again where we are, which, as I said, happens often by means of speeches. So here, we have, for example, God's speech at the beginning of Joshua, right? God says to Joshua, "Be strong and resolute to observe faithfully all the Torah." We had Joshua's speech at the end of his life, "Be most resolute to observe faithfully all that's written in the book of the Torah." We had the angel at the beginning of the book of Judges, right? "I brought you up and I took you into the land, and I said I'd never break my covenant, and you must tear down their altars, but you've been bad." And so here, after the Deborah story, we get this unnamed prophet. The Lord sent a prophet to the Israelites. Doesn't matter what the prophet's name is, who said, and then we have the message again, right? "I brought you out of Egypt, and I freed you, and I rescued you, and I drove out your oppressors, and I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You must not worship the gods of these Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you didn't obey me," right? So again, resetting us in terms of setting out the stakes of what's going on here. And with that, we enter into the story of Gideon. If the story of Ehud expands in a sort of narrative detail on the actual slaying of the foreign king, and if the story of Deborah expands on the act of leading Israelites to battle, the story of Gideon really expands on what it means for God to raise up a savior. Right? The story is marked by an impressive number of signs and symbols and miracles. Gideon asks for a sign that he is really to lead the Israelites. "Give me a sign." And he gets it, right? Fire springing out from a rock and consuming meat. There's something a little Moses-like in this episode. Just as Moses suggests that he's not really in a position to save the Israelites, so Gideon says the same. "I'm so humble," right? Gideon was the second humblest man on earth, it turns out. And just as Moses requested signs to prove it, so too Gideon requests signs. And Gideon asks for more signs, right? "If you really want me to do it, here, I'm going to test you with this piece of wool I'm putting on the floor, and if this is dry and everything around it is wet, then or vice versa, whatever." He keeps on. He gives the trick a couple of times to make sure it's for real. And then God devises this funny system of choosing who will go to fight, right? He's sort of like, everybody who drinks their water like a dog drinks the water, we're going to set apart those, and we're going to. I'll fight with those, just the ones who drink like dogs, right? Which is essentially to say, I'm going to show you that I'm the one really doing the fighting, right? I'm the one taking care of this, right? If you went with your whole army, you might think you actually won. Give me 300 dog-lapping water drinkers, right? I can win with them and one hand tied behind my back, is essentially what God is saying. So God has Gideon overhear a dream and its interpretation. This is all, again, what does it mean for Gideon to be chosen, to be selected? Right? What does raising a savior mean? What kinds of powers is this person invested with? The battle itself is miraculous, again, in a very Joshua-ish sort of way, right? Torches and horns, and they surround the camp, and everybody runs away. All of these sort of parallels in the Gideon story with Moses and with Joshua maybe help to remind us that we are dealing not with history but with narrative tropes. Right? This is what leaders look like. They do this. This is what prophets look like. They do this. This is what a warrior looks like. This is a sign. This is a miracle, right? A sign authenticating prophetic leadership. Like it's a narrative trope. It's a standard thing. It comes back. It's Moses. It's Gideon. It's Elijah. It's Jesus, right? Like no, I said it. Like it's like these are common narrative tropes that we should view in that sense. Gideon's story also introduces us to the question of hereditary rule in Israel, which we're going to take up in detail in section this week. But a brief overview: the people offer Gideon kingship, and he refuses. And after his death, his son Abimelech kills off all of the rest of Gideon's sons and has himself proclaimed king, at least in his hometown of Shechem. And Gideon's other son, Jotam, who escaped the slaughter, lays a curse on Shechem for having anointed Abimelech as king. And that curse comes to pass when Abimelech is killed by having a millstone dropped on him by a woman in a tower and is then stabbed by his own slave. Which is basically the most ignominious death possible, right? And there's something that happens here, again, a nice sort of narrative moment for us, a nice sort of interplay between the story and the reader that happens here. Abimelech asks his servant, his slave, to kill him for the explicit purpose of not having people say about him that he was killed by a woman. But we read the story, right? We have the text in which we know he's killed by the woman, right? And so he gets doubly embarrassed, right? Through the story itself and through the event and the telling of the event, right? We as the readers get to laugh at him both for the fact that he is killed by having a woman drop a millstone on his head, and laugh at him for thinking that he could somehow have that not be known and gets also stabbed. Then we go through a couple of minor judges, Tola and Yair, and I'm sorry if anybody really wanted to know about them. But then we get to Jephthah. But first, again, before we get to Jephthah, the historian reminds us what's going on, again in a speech, right? You cried out to me, I saved you. You've forsaken me and served other gods. I won't deliver you again. Go, cry to the gods you've chosen. Let them deliver you, which is one of my favorite of God and prophetic tropes, is like Joshua at the end of his life, where he's like, I'm going to serve God. You guys can serve whoever you want to, but best of luck with that. Like, I really love the go ahead, be my guest kind of trope. So then we get into the story of Jephthah, who's famous for one thing really and one thing only. But there's a whole story of Jephthah before we get to mention of his daughter. My favorite part of which is the discussion between Jephthah and the king of Ammon. The king of Ammon reminds Jephthah that when the Israelites were crossing the wilderness, they took Ammonite lands. Right? When Israel came from Egypt, they took my land from the Arnon to the Yabok, as far as the Jordan. Now give it back. And Jephthah says, we didn't do that. Nope. And he repeats almost verbatim the same sort of narrative. Again, they're both quoting from Numbers 20, essentially. But Jephthah adds an important element. We didn't seize the land of Moab, but God did. And that actually, that allows Jephthah to make a pretty good point. Now then, God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, dispossessed the Amorites. You want to have it now? Right? Like, when your God conquers other nations, don't you keep it? Right? Don't you hold what Kamosh your God gives you to possess? So what God gives us, we'll keep. Thank you very much. And then he goes on to say, look, 300 years now, my people, this is Jephthah speaking, 300 years Israel has been inhabiting Heshbon and its area, and Aroer and the area around it. And you haven't tried to get them back a single time. I haven't done you any wrong. Why are you trying to take this land from me? This is like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in one little biblical chapter. I've had this land this whole time. Why do you want it back? God gave me this land. You can't have it back. Wouldn't you take your gut? Right? Like it doesn't get very. It's not so good. It's after this that Jephthah makes his famous pledge. If you deliver the Ammonites into my hands, then whatever comes out the door of my house to meet me on my safe return from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's and be offered by me as a burnt offering, which honestly is such a dumb thing to have said out loud. But actually is a reminder, since it sounds so ridiculous to us, we should remember that in ancient Israel, domestic animals frequently lived inside people's houses. They were a source of warmth, so you would find sheep and even cattle that lived inside the house. So it's not like he was like, yeah, for sure it's going to be a person. What else would come out to meet me, right? I think he was thinking animal. But of course, it's not. Right? What's sad about the pledge is he didn't need to make it at all. Right? He had the Spirit of the Lord upon him already, as did Othniel and Gideon. They didn't need any sort of vows or pledges to win their battles. Right? It was sort of like a rash, unnecessary thing that Jephthah said. Right? But he did say it, and then he did win the war. And at that point, what choice does he have? Right? The expectation of the reader, I think, is that God will intervene. Right? Just like God intervened to spare Isaac when in Genesis 22 with Abraham. But the intervention we might be expecting never comes. And we'll notice that while Isaac in the story in Genesis is kept totally in the dark about what's going on until the moment where he's like, wait a second. Right? Here, Jephthah's daughter knows from the get-go and accepts her fate. So, what is going on in the story of Jephthah and Jephthah's daughter? Right? Is this a story that is sort of condoning child sacrifice? For one thing, I may have mentioned this previously in conversation about Genesis 22, if I was talking about it then. Right? We should remember that child sacrifice was a thing that happened. Right? It's a thing that happened in ancient Israel, not so often, obviously, but not so impossibly that this is unimaginable. But this isn't really the type of usual child sacrifice that we would see in the ancient Near East. Usually, a sacrifice precedes the thing that, right, it's like, I really need something to happen, right? Whether it's winning a war or guaranteeing a good harvest or rain, you sacrifice, you do this wild kind of sacrifice first in order to bring about the great thing you're hoping that God will give you. But here, of course, it comes afterwards. So I would suggest that while it's hard to get around the sacrifice of the child, that's not what the story is about. The story is not about child sacrifice. The story is about making rash vows. Right? The lesson to be drawn from the story has nothing to do with child sacrifice and everything to do with don't promise dumb stuff. Right? Don't make rash vows, because vows cannot be broken. Right? The story has a moral. Right? Like it's like an Aesop's fable like story. Right? Right, or right, and that, kids, is why you never make a vow to God. That's crazy like that. In fact, I will add, just as a brief aside, that in Judaism, in the law collection of the Talmud from the 2nd through 6th century CE, there are 2 entire tractates about making oaths and vows, about all the laws about them. Here's how you do it. Here's how one could possibly be altered. Here's how one could be taken back. Here's pages upon pages of laws about how to do oaths and vows. And the main thing they keep on coming back to is, but you should never do this under any circumstances ever anyway. We'll tell you how to do it, but don't do it. Right? And this story essentially exemplifies exactly that. And of course, the story also has this funny ideological element to it too. Why do the maidens in Israel go chant dirges in the hills every year? This is why. Did they actually do it? I don't know. I wasn't there. The final act in the Jephthah story is the battle between Gilead and Ephraim, which is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, we again have the question of which tribes are fighting in the wars, right? The men of Ephraim mustered, and they said to Jephthah, how come you went to fight without calling us to fight with you? We'll burn down your house, which seems like an overreaction. Again, we saw this already in the song of Deborah in Judges 5. And here, ironically, the Ephraimites who didn't fight against Ammon with Jephthah decide they need to fight someone, so they're going to fight Jephthah. The second and more interesting part of the story, certainly more famous, is the shibboleth bit. Right? What we have here, and it's a wonderful, not only for giving us the English word shibboleth, but what we have here is like a biblical record of the existence of dialect in ancient Israel, right? Depending on where you were from, you pronounce the same letter as sh or s. Right? Some people said sibboleth, some people said shibboleth. They're saying the same word, right? It's just dialect, right? We have a million of them. I have recently been watching the Great British Bake Off. And that is nothing if not a record of the variety of the English dialect, and is wonderful, if only to hear people speak. Anyway, but it's amazing, right? That we should in the Bible itself have this sort of a record of the recognition of we pronounce things one way and they pronounce things a different way, right? Which is something we again don't think about very often because we don't think about the Israel of the Bible as being like, we think of it as, we want to talk about its historicity, but we think of it as being like real, right? Like real societies are varied and have dialects and like don't understand each other and are aware of these things. And it's fun for the Bible to leave us a record of that momentarily. Okay, I'm going. Samson. The story is actually so famous, I'm not going to spend that much time on it. But there are a few elements that I think are worthy of special attention. First, the story of Samson's birth. An angel appears to Samson's mother and tells her, again, narrative tropes, right? This is the trope that we would call annunciation, and we would call it a narrative trope everywhere that it happens. An angel appears to Samson's mother, tells her that she will have a son. We have an annunciation to Sarah. We have an annunciation to Rebecca. We have an annunciation to Mary. I'm not teaching that testament, but you guys should see where I'm going. You're going to get there yourselves next year. An angel appears to Samson's mother and tells her she will have a son and that he has to be a Nazirite, right? He can't drink any alcohol or become impure or cut his hair. But she and her husband think that this angel, this divine messenger being, was just like some dude, just like a prophet. So Samson's father asks that the person come back and repeat the message. And when the man comes back, it becomes suddenly clear that this was, in fact, an angel, a divine being. This sort of thing actually happens with some frequency. A divine messenger, or sometimes God himself, appears to people and they don't realize it. Right? They don't. It doesn't sink in. And then there's this moment where the fog lifts, and they're like, "Oh no, that was God. I totally forgot to ask for my Christmas present," or whatever it is. Right? Again, this is a common trope in biblical narratives. This happens also. It just happened in the story of Gideon. They're like, "Oh no, that was actually an angel, a messenger." Now, the story of Samson proper is really the story of a man who has terrible taste in women. For one thing, he keeps choosing women from among his enemies. So first, he chooses to marry a Philistine woman. And again, we might think about how this conforms to the broader Deuteronomistic whole position of like, you cannot intermarry, right? But Samson's story, again, which I will tell you has an independent existence outside of the historian's framework, clearly has no issue with this. Or if it does, it's not the same issue. Right? It's not that Samson marrying a Philistine woman is going to bring about apostasy of the Israelites. It's just going to bring about bad things for Samson. He marries an unnamed Philistine woman, and then he has this bizarre encounter with a lion and some bees. I bring that up because just for fun with that, he proposes a riddle to the people at his wedding feast, which is the most annoying kind of riddle because it's entirely unsolvable. No one could possibly ever get this riddle correct because they would have to have known that he had just happened to find some bees in a lion's skeleton. Right? Like, that's the story. He found bees in a lion's skeleton. He's like, I have a riddle for you. Like, no one's going to be like, I bet you found bees in a lion's skeleton, dude. Like, that's not, nope, worst kind of riddle. And amazingly, the people, like this riddle becomes the basis of the whole story, where the people get Samson's wife to nag him into providing the answer, right? Oh man, what was it that you like that is the answer to your ridiculous riddle? And eventually, when Samson realizes that they got the answer only because they had gotten it out of his wife, who got it out of him, we get. I must say, this is not a. This is not the kind of line that one could say today and get away with it. But for the Bible, this is a pretty great line. If you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have guessed my riddle. Is I think as close to a one-liner as the Bible has to offer us. I think they knew that this was funny. It was meant to be funny. Samson, as we know, has a problem with anger management, because upon this he went down to Ashkelon, killed 30 men, stripped them, and left in a rage. He's like those guys. It's not even the guys who answered the riddle, right? This is like 30 other guys he decided to kill. He has an anger management problem. Really, he has a problem with women. Samson's wife then went and married one of his buddies from the wedding, and then later on, he went to Gaza and met a prostitute and slept with her, and thereby got himself into more trouble. He's got a women problem, and that's all before he gets to Delilah. Which again, and that story really is so well known. I'm honestly not even going to touch it, except to say that the obvious moral of the Samson story is: fool me once, shame on you; fool me twice, shame on me; fool me 3 times. I think it's still probably just increasingly on me at that point. Okay, Samson's the end of the story of the judges proper, many of which are really terrific stories in their own right. What I want to point out, though, is that the Deuteronomistic historian keeps pretty silent in the stories themselves. Right? The story of Samson just goes on. It's a great story, but we don't get anything from the historian in that story. The commentary just comes before and after the narratives of the judges. And the historian just comes along and hammers home the basic concepts, right? Sin, punishment, repentance, rescue. And then lets the stories tell themselves, right? And the stories, the Samson story, for example, the Deborah story, none of the stories in themselves are really about Israelite sin and punishment, right? They're individual little hero stories. Right? And they probably come from local communities who counted these heroes as their local champions, their local heroes. You might note where all of the judges are from. I hope that map is vaguely seeable. But Ehud is said to come from Benjamin, which is not so much listed there. But is south, just a little bit south of Ephraim. And Deborah comes from Ephraim, we're told, and Gideon comes from Ophrah in Ephraim, which you can see right there is down to the south east of the M of Ephraim, Ophrah. And Abimelech comes from Shechem, which you see is just south of the word Manasseh. And Jephthah comes from Gilead, right across from Ephraim. Samson comes from Dan, right, just south of Ephraim. Right? All of the judges are from this one little area. They're all from the central hill country. Right? So what we're seeing here is probably a collection of old sort of legends, hero stories from this area that have been collected and reconfigured into a literary form. Right? And every story of a judge becomes an opportunity for the historian to make his case. Each of these local stories would have been their own, this is our hero. But by putting them into a chronological order, hero, hero, hero. Well, why did you need so many heroes one after another? You kept on screwing up. Right? So you need to be, and then you repented. So you need to be and then you were rescued, and then you screwed up. Right? The historian can take this collection and turn it into something that is proof of Israelite backsliding. Then at the end of the book, there are 2 stories that aren't about the judges at all, as a sort of ruling form of government, but are super fascinating stories in their own right. First, we get the story about Micah and his private Levite priest. So Micah had a house of God. He had himself a temple. And he made an ephod and teraphim, these are cultic items, and inducted one of his sons to be priest. He has a private temple with his own cultic items. And a Levite from Judah wanders through, and Micah's like, hey, why don't you be the priest at my private temple? And the Levite's like, sure, I'll be the priest at your private temple. And this, in Micah's eyes, is a very good thing. Right? I know that now Yahweh will prosper me because I've got a Levite as my personal priest. Okay, what? Like, people had private temples and personal priests, right? What happened to you will worship only in the place that the Lord your God will choose? Well, what happened is God hasn't chosen yet, right? This story, in effect, describes precisely the situation that stands in the background of the laws of Deuteronomy, right? What was it like before? Before there was one centralized temple in Jerusalem, we had Levites who were local priests who made their living off of tithes and sacrificial offerings at local temples. Right? And local temples could be in towns, and they could be personal, private individuals. Right? There wasn't centralization of worship. There were Levites who wandered the countryside looking for work. And when centralization, according to Deuteronomy, happens, Micah's Levite is going to be out of a job, right? But it hasn't happened yet, right? And Deuteronomy and the history know that, right? We don't have a temple in Jerusalem yet, so we're still in this pre-centralized situation with roving Levites and local sanctuaries. Now, as the story continues, we're told that the tribe of Dan hasn't been assigned any territory yet, which is a funny idea. Like, they were just wandering around. Like, I don't know, what do you think about here? We won't mention the fact that even back in Joshua 19, they were decidedly assigned territory. But the book of Judges thinks not. So the Danites send some spies. I went too far. The Danites send some spies who discover this Levite at Micah's house. And they also discover this town called Laish up in the north, which they're like, oh, we could settle there. And the spies come back with their report, and off go the Danites, and they pick up Micah's priest and take them with him. And the priest, it turns out, isn't so loyal to Micah. Right? They're like, come on, would you rather be priest to one dude or priest to an entire tribe? And the priest was delighted. And indeed, off he goes. And then Micah tracks him down, and we get this like fantastic interchange. The Danites are like, oh, hey, Micah. What's up? Which is like this totally super disingenuous. And he's like, you took my priest and my gods and you walked. What do you mean, what's the matter? And they're like, hey, if I were you, I wouldn't shout so loud. You never know who might attack you and your family be out of the life. I'll have more mafia jokes later. And then the Danites come to Laish, and they conquer it, and they set up their Levite as a priest. And you will note, again, thinking back to the book of Joshua, where the Danites had territory, but lost it, and they migrated and made war on a place called Leshem, which sounds a lot like Laish, and they captured it, and they put it to the sword, and they settled in it. So again, we've got two sort of versions of Danite migration and settlement, both both collected in our history, both presumably from different sources originally. Note the explicit reference to the question of the Deuteronomic law. Right? They maintained the sculptured image that Micah had made throughout the time that the sanctuary was in Shiloh, but only through that period, because after Shiloh, the temple is built, and then for sure no more. Okay, and finally, and I promise I'm about to finish, finally, the story about the war against Benjamin at the very end of the book. And I want to make 2 points here. First, it turns out that these people of Gibeah, who are the bad guys in the story, are a pretty familiar type, right? This depraved lot who gathered around the house and pounded the door and said, bring out the man who's come to your house that we may be intimate with him. We already met these people back in a different guise, back in Genesis, right? And just as Lot did not offer his house guest to the townspeople, so too this old man says, no, why don't you take my daughter instead, right? Here's my virgin daughter and the concubine of the guy who came to visit. Do whatever you like with them, but don't do anything to this guy. Which I suppose is a form of hospitality. The townspeople are not having it. They keep pressing. And the difference between this story and the one in Genesis is this guy has no divine messengers to save him. So the man, that is the visitor, pushes his concubine out the door to save himself. And it doesn't go well. She is raped and dies and is lying there dead on the doorstep the next morning. And so the man does what anyone would do in such a situation. He cuts her up into 12 pieces and distributes her among the tribes of Israel. So that's a thing that happens in your Bibles. So first we have the parallel with the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, which again, narrative tropes, right? Narrative tropes. Let me keep coming back to that. The story also speaks to Israel's self-definition as a 12-tribe league. Because after they have defeated Benjamin, they realize, we're down to 11. Right? We've just eliminated one of our own tribes. And their solution, which is to steal a bunch of girls from a couple of towns and sort of turn them into the next generation of Benjaminites, isn't optimal. But the concern for preserving the 12 tribes as these 12 tribes is interesting historically, and an interesting contrast to what we saw back in Judges 5, for example. And this all gets at one of the underlying concerns for the entire book. But the period of Judges is a period in which there is no Israel as a whole. Right? We came out of Joshua, where all of Israel fought together. It didn't matter whether it was your land that we were conquering or somebody else's. All of Israel fights as one, and Israel works together. And only when their communal battles are over do they separate into their various tribes and pieces. But once they've done that, it becomes something of a free-for-all. Some tribes fight, some tribes didn't. Some fought each other. Some are stealing each other's priests. Right? It's a mess because Israel is not essentially unified. And all this mess is leading up to the question of centralized Israelite leadership. As the very end of the book makes clear, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as he pleased. That's the problem that's presented to us by the book of Judges, especially by the end. And that is what we will get to in our class next time. See you then.